The smell reached him before anything else did. It was sweet and wrong, the way fruit turns in the heat, except it was October, and the air coming off those trees was cold enough to see. He pushed through the iron gates with his lantern raised and stopped dead in the doorway of the dining room. The table was still set. Candles had burned down to nothing, leaving wax pulled hard across the linen, and every chair was pushed back at the same time. It looked like 12 people had stood up at the same moment and simply walked away from a meal they had spent all day preparing. Where did they go? And why does it look like they meant to come back? That is what the first man through those gates reported to the authorities. Nobody believed a word of it until they climbed the hill and saw the scene for themselves. Blackwood Manor did not appear on the county social calendar the way other estates did. It sat back from the road by nearly 2 miles, hidden behind a corridor of longleaf pine that blocked it from view in every season. You had to know it was there to find it, and most people in the valley preferred not to know. The Hargrove family built the place in 1857, which was about 4 years before the war changed every calculation a southern family of that standing had ever made. They chose stone construction, which was unusual for a region where timber was cheap and plentiful, but that choice said something about how the Hargroves thought about permanence. They weren't just building a house, they were building a position. It was the kind of structure that communicates, even from a distance, that the people inside it do not require your approval to exist. Colonel Edmund Hargrove had inherited the timber rights to several thousand acres of deep woodland from his father, and he had converted that inheritance into something closer to a small private kingdom. The formal gardens were designed by a landscape architect brought in from Charleston, and the grounds included a carriage house, a separate kitchen, a smokehouse, and a well house. There were enough servant quarters to house a staff of at least 11 people year-round, which meant the estate did not just sustain itself, it deliberately sealed itself off from the outside world, and called that independence. The colonel himself was 63 by 1882, and by most accounts he was a man who did not soften with age. The letters that survive from people who knew him describe someone who valued precision, kept formal hours, and expected the same from everyone under his roof. His wife, Margaret, managed the household with the same controlled efficiency, and their 2 adult children lived on the property in the way adult children sometimes do when the family gravity is strong enough to hold them. They weren't trapped exactly, but they weren't quite free either. Social life at Blackwood ran on invitation and obligation. The dinner party circuit across that part of the county connected isolated estates the way rivers connect towns, and the Hargroves participated on their own terms. They hosted twice a year at most, and accepted invitations selectively. But when they did entertain, it was formal and reportedly impressive. These were the kind of evenings where the food and the silence arrived in equal measure. The staff made these evenings possible. There was a head cook who had worked at the manor since the 1860s, a groundskeeper, 2 house servants, a stable hand, and several others whose names appear only in payroll ledgers. 11 people were employed full-time, and as far as anyone could later determine, every one of them was present on the grounds in October of 1882. None of them were ever accounted for afterward. The last confirmed record of ordinary life at Blackwood comes from a delivery ledger held at a general store in the nearest town, 8 miles east. A receipt dated October 12, 1882, documents the delivery of dry goods, including flour, salt, 2 bottles of imported wine, and a quantity of candles. The signature at the bottom belongs to the groundskeeper, and it is a completely unremarkable piece of paper. It represents the kind of transaction that happened 1,000 times a year across the county. But it is the last time anyone signed for anything at Blackwood Manor. 2 days after that delivery, the household prepared for a dinner party. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks prior, and 6 guests were expected from the tight network of families the Hargroves maintained contact with. It was a formal occasion, an autumn dinner, and the kind of event that would have required the kitchen staff to begin their work before sunrise. The evening of October 14th, 1882, arrived the way evenings do, quietly and without any announcement. Inside the manor, candles were lit, wine was opened, and the table was set for 10 people. It was the last thing that ever happened there. 6 guests were expected to arrive at the manor that evening, and while the surviving records don't give us a full picture of every face at the table, we have enough names from county letters and church registries to sketch out the room. There was a neighbouring planter and his wife, both in their 50s, who had been acquaintances of the colonel for many years. A widowed woman from a family 2 counties over appeared in Margaret Hargrove's personal letters as a trusted friend. And a younger man, the son of a business associate, had been invited for the very first time. Then there was at least one other person whose identity has sparked endless disputes among the historians who have looked into this case, mostly because the name in the guest correspondence doesn't match a single family in the county registry for that entire period. That one small detail matters more than it seems, and it's something we will have to come back to later. The food itself tells us a lot about the scope of the evening and the intent behind it. The kitchen at Blackwood sat in a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, and a dinner of this scale would have required that kitchen to be running from the early morning hours. Based on the remnants left on the table, the menu included what looked like a game dish, almost certainly venison or wild boar given the season, alongside preserved vegetables, fresh bread, and that imported wine from the October 12th delivery. A meal that size, with that level of preparation, is not something you just throw together 3 hours before the guests arrive. Which means someone woke up that morning with a plan and followed it all the way to the table. The guests arrived sometime after dark, presumably by carriage, as autumn evenings in that part of the South lose the light quite early. The lanterns along the approach to the manor would have been lit by the time the first wheels came up the drive, and inside, the table was meticulously arranged for 10 people. The physical evidence suggests all 10 seats were occupied at some point during the meal, because 10 sets of cutlery show use, 10 glasses were poured, and 10 chairs were pushed back from the table in a way that indicates people who stood up under their own power. That last part is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells us there was no struggle. No chair was knocked over, no glass was broken, and the candles burned down at the natural rate they always do, which means whatever happened didn't happen fast enough to interrupt the light. The working assumption among researchers is that the meal reached at least its second course before the evening came to a sudden stop. The arrangement of the dishes suggests service was still in progress, marking a transitional moment between courses, rather than a clean ending or a panicked beginning. Something interrupted the dinner at a point when the evening felt normal enough that nobody had yet made a sudden move or felt the need to flee. What that something was is the one question that has never found an answer. The simplest reading of the physical evidence is that everyone at the table stood up more or less at once and walked out the door. They went together, or perhaps in a group that followed someone else. moving through the door and into the night, towards something, or away from something. The woods begin less than 100 yards from the rear of the house, and the ground between the back steps and the tree line is flat and open. In October, with no moon to guide them, it would have been completely dark past the reach of any lantern carried from inside the house. But here's the detail that keeps people up at night. No lanterns were missing from the house. That means either they went into the dark without a single light, which is its own kind of terrifying statement, or someone from outside the house was already there carrying a light and they followed it. Neither explanation is comfortable to think about, and both require a degree of intention that makes the word accident very hard to use. The servants weren't sitting at the table, but they were certainly on the property that night. The kitchen staff, the groundskeeper, the stable hand, and the house servants would have been moving between the kitchen building and the dining room all evening. Every single one of them was gone. Not just the family, and not just the guests, but every living soul on the estate. Nobody noticed for 3 weeks, because when you weren't invited to Blackwood, you simply didn't go, and nobody was expecting an invitation back. The man who finally found the house wasn't looking for a mystery, he was just looking for money he was owed. A dry goods merchant from the town 8 miles east had been waiting on payment for the October 12th delivery since the invoice came due in late October. When November arrived and no payment followed, he sent a letter. And when no reply came to the letter, he sent his assistant out to the manor with a second notice and instructions to collect the debt if possible. The assistant came back without the money, and without an explanation, because nobody had answered the door. So the merchant waited another week before he finally rode out himself. He pushed through the front gates on a morning in mid-November, about 5 weeks after that dinner party had taken place. The grounds were overgrown, in that specific way that happens when no one has touched them in a month. Not looking abandoned exactly, but feeling fundamentally wrong. It was the kind of wrong you feel in your bones before you can even name what it is, and he noted later that the silence was the first thing that struck him. An estate with 11 staff members on the grounds has a particular sound of animals and movement, but Blackwood had none of it. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open, and the smell hit him from the interior, that rotted sweet thickness that had already moved past rancid into something drier and staler. It was the smell of organic matter that has finished decomposing and is now just sitting in the stagnant air. He walked through the entrance hall into the dining room and stopped dead, because everything was exactly where it had been left. The table was still set, the dishes were still in place, and the wax from the candles had pooled and hardened across the linen in formations that preserved the shape of the flames that had made them. He went through the rest of the house, room by room, to see if anyone was left. In the study, the Colonel's papers sat open on the desk, with a pen resting across the page, as though it had been set down between 2 sentences. The parlour was undisturbed, and in the bedrooms upstairs, clothes were still folded in the drawers, while personal effects sat on the dressing tables. He found a pair of women's gloves laid flat on a chair beside the wardrobe, which is the kind of careful placement that implies someone expected to pick them up again in just a few minutes. In one of the upstairs rooms, he found a child's wooden horse on the floor beside the bed, positioned upright and facing the door. There was no child registered as living at Blackwood Manor, and since he didn't know what to make of that, he simply wrote it down and moved on. The servants' quarters were exactly the same, with all their belongings in place and the beds made or unmade the way they'd been left, on the morning of October 14th. Personal items sat on the shelves, and a coat still hung on a hook, while the kitchen building held the remnants of that evening's preparation, with pots and tools left mid-use. He even found a cutting board with dried residue still on it, looking as if the cook had stepped away for a moment and never returned. He rode back to town as fast as he could and told the people what he'd found. The initial response was a wave of disbelief that shaded quickly into something quieter and much harder to name. People in that community knew Blackwood, and they knew the Hargroves kept to themselves, but they had always kept to themselves within a recognizable pattern. This was outside any pattern anyone could account for, and the stories that started circulating in the days that followed weren't the dramatic kind. They were the hedged, careful kind of stories that people tell when they're not quite sure what they're allowed to be afraid of yet. The county sheriff received a formal report 3 days after the merchant's visit, and rode out to Blackwood himself on a grey afternoon in late November. What he documented when he got there has never fully left the minds of the people who have read it. Sheriff Leland Croft's official report runs for 14 pages in the county archive, and reading it feels like watching a man try to solve an equation that simply refuses to balance. The language is formal and precise, written with the short, declarative sentences that the official documents of that era always demanded. He recorded his observations without any interpretation, but if you look closely at the text, you start to notice what is actually missing from those pages. There are no conclusions to be found, not even tentative or working ones, and the report is just a steady pile of details that add up to nothing Croft was willing to put his name behind. He catalogued every single thing he saw, and that specific word appears constantly in later accounts, because Croft moved through the manor like a man taking inventory of a warehouse. He went room by room and item by item, recording what was there and what was gone with the same level of cold attention. There were no bodies found anywhere on the property, or within a quarter-mile of the tree line, and he found no traces of blood on any surface inside the house. No locks had been forced, no windows were broken, and no doors showed any damage to their frames. The structure was perfectly sound, the well water was clean, and there was no evidence of fire or flooding to explain why a family would vanish. He made note of the chairs and the candles, and he even noted the pen lying across an open page in the study. He recorded exactly what that page said, which turned out to be a partial entry in the Colonel's household accounts that ended right in the middle of a sentence. It was the kind of sudden interruption that implies the writer fully expected to come back and finish the thought in just a moment. Then he searched the servants' quarters again, doing it much more systematically than the merchant had during his first frantic visit. This is the part where the report shifts its tone in a way that is almost hard to catch, but the change is definitely there. Finding the family's expensive belongings left behind is one thing, because a wealthy family with resources might leave furniture or dishes if they were running from a legal problem. But the servants' personal belongings were left behind too, including things that people of that class simply do not leave if they are moving for good. The head cook had worked that estate for over 20 years, yet she left behind her small Bible, her personal letters, and a tin filled with her saved coins. The stable hand left all his tools, and a house servant left her good pair of boots right by the door instead of taking them with her. You don't leave your good boots behind when you run away. Theories began to circulate almost immediately, because an event like this in a small county generates speculation the way summer heat generates humidity. The first serious idea anyone put forward was mass flight, suggesting the Hargroves had received some kind of warning about financial ruin and organized a quiet departure for the whole staff. It had a certain logic to it, but that theory couldn't explain the personal items, or the mid-sentence account entry, or the food still sitting in the serving dishes. The second theory involved some kind of contamination in the food or the water, a substance that might have caused enough confusion to drive a group of people out into the dark woods. This idea was taken more seriously years later than it was at the time, mostly because the science in 1882 wasn't advanced enough to prove the argument one way or the other. The well was eventually tested and found to be clean, and by the time Croft arrived, the food had decomposed too much for any useful analysis. The third theory was foul play from an outside party, someone who came to Blackwood that night with a dark purpose and left without leaving a single trace. This was the idea the sheriff's report spent the most time circling, yet he never actually landed on it because there was no evidence of intruders. He documented no extra boot prints, no abandoned equipment, and no signs of a struggle anywhere between the house and the edge of the forest. 6 weeks after he opened the investigation, Croft officially closed it. The case was listed as unresolved pending new information, but in practice, everyone knew the work was done. The Hargrove name carried a lot of weight in county politics, so nobody pushed for a second look, and the lack of bodies made the legal status of the whole thing a mess. No crime could be proven, and no victim could be officially named. But the manor didn't stay empty, or rather, it stayed exactly as it was, and that is the part that starts to feel deliberate. For the first few years after Croft closed his books, Blackwood sat in a legal gray zone that nobody in the county was particularly eager to resolve. The Hargrove family had no surviving relatives on record, and without bodies to examine, the state couldn't issue death certificates or start the probate process. This left the land in a kind of administrative limbo, where it was technically owned by people who had stopped existing without ever legally dying. The county made no move to seize the property, and the neighboring families made no move to claim it for themselves. The road leading to the front gates grew over so slowly that within 10 years you couldn't even tell a path had ever been there. The people living nearby developed a relationship with the estate that wasn't quite fear, but it wasn't quite avoidance either. It was more like the way a person learns not to press on a fresh bruise, where you don't forget it's there, but you just naturally root your life around it. Farmers who worked the land next to the Blackwood trees stayed well away from the fence line, and hunters who knew those woods by heart simply avoided the eastern edge where the manor sat. Nobody organized this behavior, and nobody ever put it into words. It was just a collective decision made by a community that decided, without ever holding a meeting, that some things are better left alone. The folklore that grew up around the estate wasn't as dramatic as an outsider might expect to hear. There were no specific ghost stories or named apparitions, and nobody told tales of a pale figure standing at an upstairs window. What people shared instead were warnings that came without any explanation, like telling someone not to go near Blackwood after dark, or not to touch the iron gates. These were the kinds of instructions you give to a child when you want them to stay away from danger, but you don't want to explain why, because the truth is either too complicated or too frightening to say out loud. Inside the manor itself, time seemed to move differently than it did in the rest of the world. That might sound like a metaphor, but it isn't entirely one. A local historian named Graves got permission to enter the property in 1911 through a deal with the land office, and he wrote down everything he saw in a journal. He described a dining room where the wax drippings on the table had turned into hard, white structures that preserved the ghost shapes of the candles. He found the study where the Colonel's accounts still lay open to the exact same page Croft had seen in 1882, because in all those years not a single person had turned it. He even found a parlor clock that had stopped at 11 minutes past 9, a detail he noted carefully because he seemed to think it meant something important. What Graves described most vividly wasn't the objects themselves, but rather the strange quality of the stillness inside those rooms. He wrote that it felt less like a house that had been abandoned and more like a house that had been paused. That was his specific word, paused, as if someone had intended to come back and finish what they were doing, but just hadn't gotten around to it yet. By the time more professional investigators started looking at Blackwood decades later, the manor had built up a second history on top of the first one. It was now a history of people approaching the house, entering the rooms, and leaving with more questions than they had when they arrived. The original disappearance was the crime, if you can even call it that, but the way the place held its shape while the world changed around it became its own kind of evidence. The real question was what exactly it was evidence of. By that point, the house was somewhere between a crime scene and a holy relic, and trying to treat it as either one felt like it wasn't enough. 4 serious theories have been put forward over the 140 years since Croft closed his file, but none of them actually managed to close the case. Each one explains a small portion of what happened that night, only to break apart against a different set of facts, which is common enough when you are looking at historical disappearances. What makes this different is that every theory requires you to accept something that feels fundamentally wrong. And the thing that feels wrong is different in every single instance. The first theory people usually land on is deliberate flight. This suggests the Hargroves were facing something they couldn't survive publicly, so they organized a disappearance and took everyone with them. Financial ruin is the most common version of this argument, because the 1880s were brutal years for southern landowners who had rebuilt after the war on credit. There were families all across the region who simply walked away from their properties rather than face foreclosure, leaving everything behind to start over somewhere else. Under this reading, the dinner party was either a cover or a coincidence, and the guests either participated in the escape or were dealt with in a way the theory doesn't like to address. The Colonel's household accounts, which were found open to a mid-sentence entry, fit this picture if you squint at the evidence from just the right angle. A man settling his books before he vanishes doesn't usually stop in the middle of a sentence, but a man who is interrupted while he is working might. What this theory cannot account for is the personal belongings of the servants. You can construct a plausible story where a wealthy family flees and takes their staff with them through some combination of loyalty and force, but you cannot construct a story where 11 working people leave behind their Bibles, their savings, and their good boots. These were people who owned very little, and the idea that they would walk away from their most valuable possessions voluntarily just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The second theory is environmental, suggesting that something in the air, the water, or the food caused a mass episode that drove everyone off the property in a state of total confusion. This could have been naturally occurring gases from disturbed soil, fungal contamination of the grain, or even a substance introduced into the food or drink on purpose. This idea has gained a lot of traction in recent decades, as our understanding of these biological mechanisms has become more precise. Ergotism, for instance, produces exactly the kind of disorientation and vivid distress that could send a group of people running from a table in the middle of a meal. The evidence against this is the total absence of bodies within any reasonable radius of the house. People who are poisoned or chemically disoriented do not usually walk very far before they stop, collapse, and are eventually found. In the case of Blackwood, nobody was ever found. The third theory involves outside violence, meaning someone came to the manor on the night of October 14th with a specific purpose and left no trace because they were careful enough to remove it. This could have been a rival family, a debt that had soured into something worse, or a political enemy that the colonel's isolation had failed to keep at bay. This theory has the advantage of not requiring the victims to cooperate in their own disappearance, but it has the disadvantage of requiring a level of precision that strains belief. Erasing 22 people from a property without leaving a single mark is not a simple task, and doing it quietly enough that no one in the surrounding area heard a thing is harder still. The fourth theory is the one nobody in the county ever stated plainly, but it runs underneath every other conversation about Blackwood, like a cold current beneath still water. The woods took them. This isn't necessarily a supernatural claim, but rather an acknowledgement that some places have a logic you cannot read from the outside, and the tree line behind the manor is the kind of place that has swallowed things before. The people who grew up near those woods believed this not because they were superstitious, but because they were observant and knew what that forest was like after the sun went down. They knew what happened to people who went into those trees without knowing exactly where they were going. What no theory has ever accounted for is the combination of elements that makes Blackwood so specific. Everyone was gone. Nothing was taken. There was no trace leading outward, and the scene looked less like an ending than a pause. That word again. What Graves saw, what Croft documented, and what the merchant felt the moment he pushed through the front door all point toward an event that didn't feel finished even to the people who were inside it. What makes Blackwood different from every other vanishing story is what was left behind on purpose. 3 objects in particular have defined how serious researchers think about Blackwood, not because they are the strangest things in the house, but because they are the most deliberate. When you are trying to understand a disappearance, the word deliberate changes everything about how you view the evidence. The first is a sealed letter discovered in the colonel's study, resting right on top of the household accounts that Croft had already documented as being open. The letter was addressed to a specific person in Charleston, a name that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hargrove correspondence that survived the years. It was sealed with wax in the proper way, which is the kind of closure you use when you intend for a letter to travel through hands other than your own. Nobody ever sent it, so it sat on that desk from October 14th until Graves found it in 1911 and noted it in his journal. What it contained was never formally established, because the letter passed through several hands after Graves documented it, and its current location is now disputed. One researcher, who claims to have read the pages, describes the contents as a set of instructions, but who they were for, and what they were meant to accomplish, is a sentence that ends without any resolution. The second object is a last will and testament, unsigned, which was found in the top drawer of the colonel's desk. This was not the official will held by a solicitor in the nearest town, which was eventually produced during the probate proceedings that dragged through the courts for years. This was a different document entirely, handwritten and dated October 14th, 1882. That is the same day as the dinner party, and the same day that, whatever happened, happened. An unsigned will has no legal weight, which is likely why it stayed in the drawer instead of being sent away. But a man who sits down on the day of a party to draft an alternate version of his final wishes is a man who knows something the rest of us don't. The third object is the wooden horse, found upright on the floor beside an upstairs bed, facing the door, in a room that no child was registered to occupy. The horse was well made and painted, the kind of toy manufactured for a specific child rather than something bought off a shelf in town. There were no children in the Hargrove household in 1882, and the guest list, reconstructed as carefully as possible, includes no families with young children. Where the toy came from, who placed it there, and why it was positioned facing the door rather than being stored away are questions that nobody has ever answered to any researcher's satisfaction. Each of these objects shares one characteristic, which is that they do not fit the profile of a hurried departure. You grab your things when you run, but you do not seal letters and leave them undelivered on your desk. You do not draft alternate wills on the afternoon of a dinner party if you do not intend to see the morning, and you certainly do not stand a child's toy at attention beside a bed in an empty room before vanishing into the October dark. This brings the most uncomfortable possibility into the room, which is that the scene at Blackwood was arranged after the fact. It suggests that someone returned to the manor after the initial event to place or position certain objects before leaving again without being seen. The sealing of the letter and the positioning of the toy could have happened then, and the will could have been placed in the drawer by hands that arrived later with a reason to shape the story before anyone came looking. If that is true, then someone survived whatever happened on October 14th, and instead of telling anyone the truth, they went back into that house and made sure it would never quite make sense. The last person known to have entered Blackwood Manor before it was formally sealed did not come out the same way they went in. The legal machinery that finally locked the doors of Blackwood Manor finished its work in 1897, which was 15 years after the disappearance had already turned the house into a ghost. A distant Hargrove relative living out in Virginia eventually dug up enough paperwork to claim the estate through a family trust. But the rules they set for the property were strange and rigid. The trust demanded that the house stay exactly as it was found, meaning no furniture could be moved, and no repairs could be made unless a trustee gave written permission first. Whether these orders were meant to keep the evidence safe, or just to keep people from looking too closely at the truth, is something we still don't know today. The result was that a crime scene became a locked vault, and for over a century, the world was forced to stay on the other side of the gate. There is a bitter irony in the fact that sealing the manor might have ruined more than it actually saved. Because no maintenance crews were allowed inside to check the pipes or the roof, moisture began to eat through the stone walls over the passing decades. Water damage eventually rotted through the lower floors and destroyed documents that can never be replaced, which means the very act of preservation turned into a slow way of erasing the past. It is a reminder that when you lock a room to protect what is inside, the room itself can become the thing that kills whatever you were trying to keep. If you were a researcher trying to get inside during the last 50 years, your luck depended entirely on who was reading your mail. A few academic requests were actually approved between the 1960s and the 1990s, but the visitors were watched like hawks and told they couldn't touch a single thing. One analyst looked at the fabric in the dining room and found that the linen on the table had been sitting there exactly as long as the legend said it had. Even though the science proved the house was as old as the records claimed, none of those tests could tell us where the people went. All the data did was prove that the mystery was real, which is a cold comfort when you are looking for a resolution that never comes. The trust that controlled the land finally fell apart in 2008 when the last trustee died without leaving anyone to take over the job. Since that day, the estate has drifted back into the same kind of legal fog it sat in during the 1880s, owned by a group that doesn't exist and watched over by no one at all. Local records call it a historic site with restricted access, but that is just a polite way of saying the house is caught somewhere between being protected and being forgotten. Every investigator who has stepped inside those quiet rooms describes a feeling that is hard to put into words, regardless of whether they believe in ghosts or just in history. They say the house has a specific way of watching you back, which isn't necessarily something supernatural, but rather the heavy weight of a question that has gone unanswered for 140 years. Some places in this world simply refuse to give up their secrets, and instead of giving you an answer, they just keep asking the same question back at you until you leave. The gates are still standing there today, made of cold iron and older than anyone who ever shared the Hargrove name. This story doesn't really have an ending because it always stops at the same wall, right before